Hello everybody, this is your week 2 video. A little bit tardy getting it posted, so my apologies for that. Your article and lecture that you read this week had to do with epistemology and sort of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and really a bit of a conversation around interrogating knowledge and what we mean by that, and who gets to determine what constitutes knowledge and what kind of power knowledge holds, depending on the group that is generating it. And so I love this article because it gets to the heart of the difference between what's considered sort of valid science and where science comes from, and what that authenticity of science looks like where gender is concerned, right? And some women's knowledge, which often is not taken very seriously or held to be very valid, really, in any kind of meaningful way. And so conversation around the herbs and methods often used for abortion, and who knew about them, and what sort of power they held in a couple of different contexts, sort of really speaks to this idea that power is inherent in absolutely everything, in our gender relations, in race relations, in our social body, even in terms of how we come to know what we know and who determines what access we have to what constitutes knowledge, and what is valid in terms of what constitutes knowledge. So when I think about trying to be cognizant of this as I move through say the media, news reports, new science, new sort of technology, these kinds of things. One of my favorite examples that really, I think, illustrates nicely differences in knowledge and what we hear and what gets determined to be valid knowledge is an example from India, where basmati rice has been growing for forever. There's some collectives operative there that look at seed saving, and at one point several years ago, some GMOs came in, like Monsanto, big companies like Monsanto and Rice Tech, insisting that farmers plant their kinds of crops, and then they would need to buy their kinds of fertilizers and pest controllers, which often meant that farmers ended up in big debt. Part of the fallout of this whole movement at one point was that Rice Tech sought to patent basmati rice. It's been growing there forever. Vandana Shiva is an ecofeminist that is part of your lecture on ecofeminism, ecofeminist spirituality. You'll read some of her work later on. Led the challenge to Rice Tech, saying that they shouldn't be allowed to patent this, that it's ludicrous that a company would decide that they're going to patent nature. And in fact, she was successful in her aim to have that thrown out, and Rice Tech was not permitted to patent basmati rice. But it's a great example because it speaks to race, it speaks to gender, it speaks to whose knowledge is valid. And so the knowledge of the earth itself, right, in that it's been reproducing basmati rice forever, wasn't considered valid knowledge. Women's knowledge of seed saving and how crops work and what conditions they grow under also wasn't considered valuable. And then we have sort of the distinction between the global north and the global south, and whose technology is better, whose knowledge is better, whose knowledge is more advanced, and the sort of ethnocentrism of the Western world, and suggesting that they would know better and could patent what is already a pre-existing natural process. Really exemplifies the power inherent in the production of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, and what gets constituted as valid knowledge, right? What we learn, and who gets to tell the story, right? And so in that way, then the kind of story that gets told, right? It's biased by where somebody is situated, always, but is presented in cases like this as though it can just be taken as fact, right? Knowledge of this nature just is, and is sort of free from the influences of all of the things that we've been talking about: race, power, gender, geography, right? Where demographics, all of those things. So another really good example is women's experiences, sort of in the both you could say in the 60s and 70s, when consciousness raising groups were happening, right? When second wave feminism really took off, and women started to realize that what was happening in their personal lives, the way that they were feeling, the dissatisfaction and the desire for something more, right? That was kind of brushed off. That being at home, being a housewife or being a mother should be enough, and that this was women's identity, was the sort of public response. But that women felt that there was something more to that. And so as they gathered, began to validate each other's experiences, but sort of socially wasn't taken as being very like a serious issue, and B, as the women couldn't really know for themselves why they were dissatisfied, or were unclear about what dissatisfaction meant, and that if they just did this or just did that, they would find fulfillment through these roles that have been prescribed for them. And sort of in a context that's a little bit closer to home, when we think about prairie women, in the early 1900s, certainly when women were being prescribed all kinds of medication, lots of women were sent to mental health institutions because they were dissatisfied, because they wanted something more, something different, that the work of sort of settling the land, the work on the farm, of establishing a homestead, and being alone in large measure, often for prairie women, was really, really difficult. And that too was kind of written off as just being a woman's condition, right? That this wasn't necessarily something that was deserving of any further investigation. And Sask Culture is now doing a project to tell sort of pioneer women's stories. And they're pretty interesting. They're available on YouTube, so I will find the link and I'll post it in our news forum so you can have a look. But women really struggled and had sort of a desire to see the world beyond the window of their farmhouse kitchen, and found it overwhelming and found it really lonely. And often we're having children one after the other, so perhaps suffering also from some postpartum. But we're prescribed pills, sort of nerve pills is one of the terms that was used for them, as though that's all it would take. That it wasn't really something serious, like I said, that needed to be investigated, that bore any further sort of exploration or consideration really at all. Women's knowledge is often like that when we think of midwives. Particularly, if we think about the burning times, the witch burnings, the witch hunts, when women were hunted down and often burned alive. Part of the problem there was that for the first time, knowledge that women held about medicine and herbs and birthing and women's health processes first hadn't been considered at all. As medicine, sort of Western medicine and science really started to take hold, it became a threat. There was no validity to it. It wasn't considered valid knowledge. It was a threat to sort of the scientific establishment, and sort of decimated, right? It was just a matter of eliminating that threat, but which is sort of another conversation in itself. But when we really think about what it means, that women's knowledge wasn't held as valuable, and it still isn't, in lots of ways, right? Women can speak to a particular experience, or simply by virtue of being women, their perspective is taken slightly less seriously, right? We still hear all of the jokes about PMS and women's hormones, and it being that time of the month, and all of these things that might impact how valid a woman's feelings, a woman's perspective might be. What she knows is always called into question. And really that's what your article talked about, and that's what the lecture was talking about, sort of in a really simplified sense. Where does knowledge come from, and how does it come to be valued? Who gets to determine that? So in this country, we see the same thing with Indigenous knowledge, in terms of the land, in terms of social bodies, in terms of self-governance, and what might be necessary for some reconciliation. Up until recently, that's a conversation that wasn't even on the table, and historically has sort of been determined by the governing powers, right? Who in large measure created the situation that we're in. So power and where you happen to sit in the social hierarchy really have a profound influence on everything that we know about the actual lived reality of our lives, right? How we know the world around us, how we see the world around us, right? What we take to be truth, and how we value any sort of knowledge that we encounter, right? We are evaluating it on terms of where it comes from, who the speaker might be, or the knower might be, and a lot of times really unconsciously. I would suggest probably most of the time unconsciously. And so part of what we are seeking to do in this particular section of the course is really to shake that up a little bit and ask some hard questions. And then hopefully, you know, as you go through the semester, in this class, other classes, in your social world, social media, right, the things that you come across, really to have a very critical eye to think about, to remember that knowledge is produced in a particular way by particular people for a particular end, and that knowledge comes to have power for a particular reason. Right? There's a reason that this particular bunch of knowledge has power in a way that this section of knowledge might not, or knowledge that comes from this particular demographic does not. There's definitely some method to the madness there. And so as you move through the rest of this week and the next, coming weeks, the next section of your courses, I hope that you will keep that in mind. Remember that Wednesday mornings I have office hours between 10 and 12, and so you can always catch me sort of in real time, right, on the live chat, or call in, or of course email anytime. I hope you're all having a really good week, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.